In the previous videos, we have examined the two major proposals for the date of the Exodus. The late date proposal, which places the Exodus in ancient Egypt's 19th dynasty, and the early date proposal, which places it approximately 200 years earlier during the 18th dynasty. While we have looked at most of the direct evidence thus far, I want to take the opportunity in this video to look at some interesting circumstantial evidence from ancient Egypt that I believe can be useful in helping to identify not only the date of the Exodus, but also its historical reality more broadly. The first thing worth examining is actually the name of the man God used to lead the Israelites out of Egypt, Moses. Historically, the belief among Jews and Christians has been that Moses authored the Torah, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Some discussion has persisted over whether Moses wrote these books directly or if he authored them by commission. Regardless, the idea that Moses was involved in producing this body of text has been an instrumental part of understanding the Bible. In the last couple of centuries, though, the view has become more popular that Moses was not the author of the Torah, rather that these books are compilations of different authors from later dates in Israel's history, with most proponents pointing to the time of the Babylonian exile as the most likely time. This position is known as the documentary hypothesis, or JEDP, an acrostic for the assumed authorial sources. The rise of this position has not only raised skepticism about Moses' authorship of the Torah, but also about the historical credibility of the Torah as a whole, including Moses' existence. I don't intend to get into a detailed examination of the Torah's authorship here. However, one of the important things we can take away from the Exodus narrative relative to ancient Egyptian history is just how common the name Moses was during the 18th and 19th dynasties. Many 18th and 19th dynasty pharaohs have Moses incorporated into their names. The Egyptian word translated as Moses is Misi, which means to give birth, or born of. According to Professor James Hoffmeyer, there is widespread agreement that at the root of the name of the great Hebrew leader is the Egyptian word Misi, which was a very common element in the theophoric names throughout the New Kingdom. As Hoffmeyer has presented, this word is actually present in the name Ramses. Thus, an alternative rendering of his name would be Ramoses. A legitimate question that should be asked of those scholars who maintain that the Torah is fiction or mythology, based on the assumption that it was compiled from various authors at a time in Israel's history long after these events supposedly took place, is: how did Jewish scribes in Babylon just happen to give their leader a name that was contemporary with the time and place of his supposed existence if they just made him up? In fact, Hoffmeyer has identified 6 terms in Moses' birth story that have Egyptian origins or influences dating back to the New Kingdom period. It seems unlikely that scribes writing in Babylon nearly 1,000 years later would get these terms right by mere coincidence. The presence of the name Moses, as well as these other Egyptian cognate words, points to the book of Exodus as being a product of the time when the events it recalls took place. Along similar lines, one of the points of frustration for Bible scholars through history has been the lack of any name associated with the pharaohs recorded in Genesis and Exodus. Our efforts to document the Exodus would be greatly helped if the names of the pharaohs of Abraham, Joseph, the oppression, and the Exodus were written down. Again, skeptics of the Bible point to the lack of any pharaonic name in these texts as evidence of them being fiction or mythology. However, Hoffmeyer makes an interesting observation relative to the Bible's lack of any pharaonic name in these passages. Throughout Genesis and Exodus, the well-known title Pharaoh is used. As a reference to the palace, this expression goes back to the Old Kingdom. But as an epithet for the monarch, it does not occur until the 18th dynasty, sometime before the reign of Thutmose III. From its inception until the 10th century, the term pharaoh stood alone, without a juxtaposed personal name. In subsequent periods, the name of the monarch was generally added on. This practice is found in the Old Testament. In the period covered from Genesis and Exodus to Solomon and Rehoboam, the term pharaoh occurs alone, while after Shishak, the title and name appear together. Thus, the usage of pharaoh in Genesis and Exodus does accord well with the Egyptian practice from the 15th through the 10th centuries. The appearance of pharaoh in the Joseph story could reflect the New Kingdom setting of the story, or, if its provenance is earlier, the late Middle Kingdom through the Second Intermediate period, its occurrence in Genesis is suggestive of its period of composition. For all of the frustration that the anonymity of the Genesis and Exodus pharaohs has caused, it happens that the practice of not recording their name is evidence of these books having been written down during the time of the events they record, rather than at a later date by scribes removed in time and location. Rather than being cause for skepticism, the lack of pharaonic names here is actually substance to biblical authenticity. Something that has been very interesting to me in my studies of Israel's time in Egypt and the Exodus narrative is that in the time period established between the early date and the late date proposals is the presence of Egypt's most enigmatic pharaoh, Akhenaten. Briefly, Akhenaten's claim to fame is that he is the one ruler in all of ancient Egyptian history who championed monotheism, the belief in and worship of one god. In an unprecedented move, this pharaoh effectively threw away the rest of the Egyptian pantheon during his reign and established a new state religion around the Aten, a sun god. There are many books and documentaries that have been produced about Akhenaten, so I will direct those interested in him to pursue those works. The reasons for Akhenaten's religious upheaval have been and continue to be shrouded in ambiguity. He is generally regarded by historians and archaeologists as the world's first monotheist. As such, many scholars regard his reign as being of influence on Moses and the early Israelites, if they are even willing to acknowledge Moses as a historical figure at all. For our purposes, this possibility could be considered if the Exodus occurred at the proposed late date, as Ramses II reigned roughly 100 years after Akhenaten. However, if we propose the early date for the Exodus, sometime between or around 1450 to 1400 BC, something really interesting happens. By most ancient Egyptian chronological assessments, 1450 to 1400 BC encompasses portions of the reigns of 2 to 3 pharaohs, Thutmose III, Amenhotep II, and, possibly, Thutmose IV. Akhenaten's reign began around roughly 1350 BC. If the events of the Exodus, namely the economic collapse of the Egyptian state and the destruction of Pharaoh's army, occurred between 50 to 100 years before his reign, it is safe to say that Egypt would have been reeling during this time to try to build itself back into a major power. It would also be wrestling with the fact that their gods proved no match to the one God of Israel. Thus, if an early date of the Exodus is to be favored, the possibility arises that Akhenaten's pagan monotheism was not unprecedented. Rather, that it may have been a reaction to the destruction and humiliation brought on Egypt in the Exodus. Instead of being the first monotheist, Akhenaten could have been attempting to either appease Israel's God, albeit ignorantly, or he was appealing to another deity who he believed would better protect Egypt in the future. Akhenaten's religious activities are not the only thing that his reign contributed to the study of the Exodus. During his time as pharaoh, Akhenaten established a new capital city called Akhetaten, which is now known as the site of Tel el Amarna. Discovered at this site was a large cache of cuneiform tablets recording correspondence between the Egyptian royal court and their contemporaries. These tablets are known today as the Amarna letters. During the 18th dynasty, Egypt maintained hegemony over many of the city-states of Canaan and the Levant, the area now encompassed by modern Israel-Palestine, Lebanon, and Syria. A portion of the Amarna letters are communication from Egypt's vassal states requesting military aid in the face of attacks by a group referred to by the Egyptians as the, quote, Habiru, and the Mesopotamians as the, quote, Apiru. Since the discovery of the Amarna letters, more than a few people have postulated a relation between the Habiru and the Hebrews during their conquest. The military activity recorded in the Amarna letters bears a generic resemblance to the exploits recorded in the Bible under the latter years of Moses and Joshua. As a term, Habiru or Apiru was used to refer to a social class of marauding people living outside of urban areas, usually with a reputation for pillaging said areas. While the designation of Habiru or Apiru appears to have been used in reference to a wide array of groups, the wandering Hebrews under Moses and Joshua could certainly be considered Habiru based on their activity. Though it once garnered more popularity, the association of the Habiru or Apiru with the Hebrews has fallen out of favor among more recent scholarship, largely due to the assumption that the Exodus occurred at the late date, during the reign of Ramses II. But, again, if the early date of the Exodus is to be favored, then the possibility arises that the Habiru of the Amarna letters correspond to the Hebrew conquest recorded in the Bible. One of the biggest issues scholars face in placing the Exodus in history is a lack of Egyptian records of the events recorded in the biblical narrative. This isn't necessarily a cause for concern, as pharaonic Egypt engaged in a large amount of propaganda, so it is unlikely that they would document their humiliation at the hands of Yahweh on a stela or temple walls. But, if the Egyptians did not record the Exodus from their perspective, is there anything we can look for in Egypt that would give credibility to the Exodus account? The answer is yes, and we will examine those criteria in the next video. Please subscribe and click the notification bell so that you will be notified when I release the upcoming videos in this series. For further reading on this subject, I recommend Israel and Egypt by James Hoffmeyer. You will find a link to this book in the description.